Canola oil, otherwise known as Lea oil, which is low erucic acid rapeseed oil. That's correct, canola oil is just a brand name for rapeseed oil. So canola is a blend of two words, which is the can from Canada and ola, just oil, so Canada oil or canola oil. That's where it got its name in the first place. So to learn about canola oil, we have to look at what it is actually, which is rapeseed oil. And if that name sounds bad, then you know where this is going. It's not about what canola oil is made of, it's about how fast it'll kill you. But let's look at the history of this particular oil. Rapeseed oil comes from the Latin word rapum, which means turnip. So essentially, it's in that sort of family of turnip seeds, mustard seeds, is all from the same family, which is all where you get rapeseed oil from. It's actually one of the oldest oils there is, funnily enough. Things in that family, particularly things like mustard seed oil, was used in India 4,000 years ago and in China and Japan 2,000 years ago. Obviously, after it was in India, they brought it over to there. So it's a very, very old oil. Does that mean it's good? No, it doesn't mean it's good. Because 4,000 years ago, in the grand scheme of humanity, isn't anything. The farming era started 10,000 years ago, and that's when sicknesses essentially came in really heavily. Sicknesses that are caused by food that is too easy to get, and then in the most modern times, processed food. So what we're going to look at isn't the whole history of oils in that family, because it doesn't even matter. What matters is, how is it produced today? Rapeseed oil was first put on the market in the 50s. That's when the whole saturated fat is bad for you came in, and all these companies that have these processed oils, which were leftover surplus from World War II, they wanted to sell it as something, so they decided, let's sell it as a food thing that is edible for people. When it came into the market, it was taken back off the market because it was basically straight poison. People didn't like it. It was very greenish in color. It wasn't good to eat. Nobody's going to have that. So they took it back off the market and rebranded it and also remade it. So the biggest problem with rapeseed oil is the high erucic acid content. That's the part that essentially makes it poisonous for people. So they took that off the market, lowered the erucic content, which is how you get low erucic acid rapeseed, which is obviously not going to be a good name. So the Canada Oil Company renamed it Canola, Can for Canada, and Ola for oil low erucic acid. So Ola, or oil low acid really. So Canada Oil Low Acid, so Canada Oil Canola. That name is like, a nice punchy brand name, so everybody was in it at that point. Now fast forwarding to the 90s, so we're getting closer to what we're talking about now. In the 90s, the Canada Oil Company re-engineered, well I should say genetically modified, the rapeseed plant so it couldn't be affected by a thing called Roundup. So if you know plants, you know what Roundup is. Roundup is a pesticide which is used heavily around the world. Well, it was, until it was banned almost everywhere except Australia for some reason. Australia really lobbied hard for the whole Roundup use. So Roundup is known to directly cause cancer to people who work with it directly. They spray that on fruits, vegetables. It kills everything, but they have to genetically modify the fruits and vegetables to not be killed by it. And this is one of them. Everything in the seed oils industry are those. They're the strongest stuff you can get. Now on that note, Australia likes to say that they have heavy fines in place for anybody using genetically modified canola seeds, rape seeds, but that really wouldn't be the case because Australia is the one that lobbied for the use of Roundup. So realistically, that's a bunch of bullshit. But as you'll learn, with seed oils, everything is. But we're going to get right into what the whole point of this is, not just to look at the history of canola, but how it's actually made and realistically why it's actually bad for you. Canola oil, after it's harvested at the farm, comes to the factory. So the factory is going to take it through a long process, and each process there's leftovers which are used for various things. So the very first thing that happens in the factory is the dirt and leftover plant product has to be separated from the seed. So that gets put through a filter, and the leftover stuff is recirculated back to being animal feed. There's going to be there's going to be some nutrition value, not like it's high nutrition, but that's what's used for some animal feed. That's what you get when you have like grain-fed animals and stuff. And then the oil continues. It's going to go through the rollers to squeeze the seeds flat, and then it's going to go through another system, which of course forces the oil out. But if you think that's what gets the oil out, that isn't what gets the oil out. Going through that process only gets about 3/4 of the oil out. The remainder is still trapped inside. Now, if this was made as a cold pressed oil, that should be good enough, but that's not going to be good enough. Because there's another way which everybody uses to extract all of the oil out. It's a long process. It's a 70-minute wash in a particular solvent, which is a hexane solvent. So hexane solvent is a chemical extraction process. This particular solvent has been well documented and known for the past 40 years to cause severe nerve damage to people who ingest it. So when they use these things for seed oil productions, they always say all of it gets extracted, but really, I mean, if it's touching the stuff and it's directly food and it's known to cause those problems, obviously that's bullshit, but people want to keep believing it, so let them keep believing it. After that, it takes the leftover husks, essentially, that aren't oil, grinds it into a paste, which becomes animal feed. That's more stuff for your grain-fed animals. Now that's after it's gone through the hexane solvent. So again, now we're looking at if you're eating grain-fed meat, that's how you start to get things that are problems when it comes to meat. Every time someone says there's a meat problem, it's actually to do with the really cheap grain-fed meats that are high in disease and other chemicals. So you want to eat grass-fed, grass-finished meat. That's right up here. Grain-fed meat is down here, and vegan food is like literally all the way to the floor. So it's still better than that, but it's still not good for you. The extracted oil now has to go through the actual refining phase. So refining phase is both to clean it and deodorize it. Now the deodorization process isn't as bad as it actually sounds. It's literally just steaming the oil with water. Probably water. So they steam it with water, and then that gets the odor of it out. Because if you had the oil straight, then you wouldn't have it because of the odor. But that's not properly refining it. To properly refine it, you need to use sodium hydroxide. Sodium hydroxide is also called caustic soda, which is essentially a brutally strong version of baking soda. If you put it on your skin, it'll literally burn through your skin. So the fact they use this in the oil production, and now it's getting really bad because we're already using hexane solvent, now we're using sodium hydroxide. It's starting to get to be like, you can really see why this is bad. And I haven't even talked about the process of high heat involved in this whole production, but we'll get to that at the end. Let's keep going through the process here. So now you've mixed it with that, which obviously you don't want the leftover sodium hydroxide, that sort of stuff in it, or even that's still gonna be left in there. What they do at that point is they spin the oil. So oil comes out and the thick leftovers come out separately. What happens with those leftovers? Again, this is for food. Those thick leftovers come out and they're used for soap. So now you've got soap in your food, but that should be the least of your concerns with all the other stuff mixed into it. At this point, the oil is clear, but it's still dark colored and it's still got a cloudy texture to it because it's got thick clumps of essentially wax type substances. So what happens at this point is they have to cool it. So they cool it to 5 degrees Celsius, and that thickens the waxes. As you know, if you've done anything like that before, it thickens that, they can filter it down. Now the waxes is how you get vegetable shortening. So if you have anything that's got vegetable shortening in it, that's a byproduct of seed oil production process after it's been through almost all the chemicals. We'll say 2 out of 3 chemicals. There's obviously more involved, but these are the main ones. So now it comes on to the very third chemical. So the third chemical is just bleaching it. So we're straight up bleaching the oil to make it nice and bright colored, depending. Some people like the yellower color, some people like the brighter color. I think brighter colored canola oil is more common in America, but I've seen other countries have that sort of stuff too, so it really depends on the place. Now, that'll be the end of that. Before we get to the heating, that's different. Let's look at the next stage. Canola oil, of course, it's so cheap, no one gives a shit. It's gonna be put in plastic, not glass. So anytime you have plastics, microplastics leak in. Oil bottles usually made of really thin plastics, and I'll get to why that is in a second. Really thin plastics, they go through their own process of, you can see here, they're being cleaned out, filled up. Everything's the same, you've had plastic stuff before. But the reason the plastic is really thin, canola oil only has a shelf life of 1 year. So because it's only got a shelf life of 1 year, They can use the absolute cheapest, thinnest plastic possible, which is known to leach out heaps and heaps of microplastics. But it doesn't matter, because if it's past a year and you get some sort of poison or something from it, they will say that it's past its use by date, so it's your problem. And that really is how everything works in the food industry. But that is the full story of the history of canola oil and the production process of canola oil. And I've told you about the 3 different chemicals that you don't want. We got 3 different chemicals. You can go back and check those out. But we're going to get to the next part of the video now, which is, why is it even bad for you? What actually makes canola oil actually bad for you? The heating process. The heating process is bad because at least 1/3 of canola oil is polyunsaturated fat. Polyunsaturated fat oxidizes, which is essentially the same as saying it rusts or poisons at 5 degrees Celsius, which is actually the exact point they call it to actually take the impurities out of it, which is interesting. That probably is getting rid of the only parts of it that are the more saturated fat part, which is true, it is, because those are the parts that are cooling, whereas the polyunsaturated fat won't cool at that temperature. It's starting to heat at that temperature. So anything that could be considered saturated or possibly even monounsaturated gets extracted at that point, and you're left with even higher doses of polyunsaturated than even statistics will lead you to believe. Once you go past the 5 degrees, like I said, oxidizing is poison. So essentially, when you heat these seed oils to high temperatures, you're creating a poison. That's pretty much it. There's no other way to put it. It's straight poison. Is the oil as bad as the poisons they use to refine the oil? No, but it's very close. Obviously, what's the point? Check this chart out right here. This chart here shows the spread between saturated in the red, polyunsaturated in the blue and orange, and monounsaturated in the yellow. So the yellow is monounsaturated fat. That's fine for you. Orange and blue is a polyunsaturated fats. Orange omega-3, blue omega-6. You don't want either of those two. Even though people always say you want omega-3, no you don't, because it's still a polyunsaturated fat. Red is what you actually want. Saturated fat. It's what everything your body's really made of. It's what your brain's made of. It's what continues development in the mind. It's really what everything is good for you. And as much as people won't like to say it, saturated fat is one of the things that also heals your body too. That's why when people have things like artery disease and stuff like that, they always find saturated fat in the arteries and they say, oh, it's clogging, not realizing, no, it's actually there to fix it. But that's an entire different video. Look back at this chart. On this chart, you can see that canola oil, now funnily enough, they're putting saturated in red because they're saying this chart's for bad versus good. They put canola oil right at the top as the absolute healthiest of the oils because it's lowest in saturated fat. But you can see there, the polyunsaturated is about 1/3, monounsaturated is a good amount. So based on monounsaturated, because it is a larger quantity, you can see here that canola oil, safflower oil, sunflower oil, and olive oil, those are the healthiest of bad oils. Except olive oil shouldn't really be there because if you look at the next stat, which is how much polyunsaturated fat, olive oil has basically no polyunsaturated fat. So olive oil should be, again, much higher on the list because that really is just pressed olives, you know, realistically, if you get the good stuff. If you get the bad stuff, it's in the same boat as everything else here, so it doesn't even matter. But yeah, looking at canola, 1/3 polyunsaturated fat. If you're looking at straight seed oils, safflower oil, according to this chart, is going to be the best one for you based on that. But actually, it's still not, because it still went through the same chemical process, the same heating process. So you don't even know if these numbers are really legit, because realistically, the saturated fat content in these should basically be nothing because it took almost all of it out. Most of these are going to be more polyunsaturated fat than it even says here, because this chart would actually be based on the cold pressed best version of these. And like I said at the start, well, I'm halfway through the video, you can see the cold press aspect of canola would be just squeezing the seeds, but there's still heating processes and refining processes involved even in cold press. So again, if it's a seed oil, it's not going to be good for you. If you continue to look at this chart to see what is good for you, funnily enough, everything that's high in saturated fat has the lowest in polyunsaturated and not too high in monounsaturated. You want regular saturated, that's the best. Coconut oil that everyone says is the worst is the best. That's pretty much right here. You got coconut oil, you got butter, you've got lard, and then mixed in there, funnily enough, is actually palm oil, which is obviously something that people wouldn't expect, but again, it's from like a fruit type object, so it is in the same category as olive because they're both just fruits that are squeezed out essentially. Everything that's a seed oil, because if you think about how much oil is going to come from a large object versus a tiny seed, that's where you can really see what the problem is. Essentially, the bigger the object that the oil is extracted from, kind of the healthier it's going to be for you. This chart will really show you, and they've got it in the wrong order. Realistically, it's worst to best. So you take that as you want it. So that's the full run through of canola oil and exactly why it's deadly and why you shouldn't have it. But there's still another aspect. Just when you think it doesn't get worse, it continues to get worse. Every time you reheat oils, then again, they just sort of increase on that rancidness. So now it's double rancid when you heat it. And then you reheat it, and then you reheat it, and reheat it, and reheat it. And that's what you get at fast food with the fries they make in the oil fries. Those are the things that are heated at very high temperatures over and over and over again. They keep reusing. And if you think one place is going to be clean, when it comes to the really expensive places, when I say expensive, I'm talking about the company, not the product. We're talking about places like McDonald's, for example. McDonald's actually gets fresh oil and then just keeps reusing it. When they're done with it, cheap companies of, smaller shops actually buy that used oil to use. That's why if you've been to like some local fish and chip shop that's really cheap and dirty inside, you know what I'm talking about if you know what I'm talking about. It's got this very specific smell to it, which is, it's hard to explain, but if you know type thing. That particular smell is just like pure rancidness because their oil is used oil that's used oil. So it's like, if you want to think of one of the worst foods you could possibly eat, it would probably have to be fish and chips, essentially, from a very, very cheap store that has a smell to it. And you know what I'm talking about. That's probably the worst food. That's probably the worst thing that's classified as food that you could probably eat. But, when you go to those particular guys, they'll say it's good quality, bro. So, yeah, pretty much.